Howdy ESSM 406. In this talk I'm going to talk about social justice or equity, concerns, and the environment. This is something that I'm personally very passionate about. I've spent a lot of time working in developing countries, and I believe that we can't really solve our environmental problems without dealing with some of these equity and social justice issues. I also know from past experience teaching here at A&M that sometimes these are a little bit harder for students here to grasp. I think they require thinking about the world in a slightly different way than many of you are accustomed to. Here's the problem. The market model that we've been talking about that says that public goods and common pool goods and externalities are violations of the allocative efficiency of a competitive market is basically about finding ways to be efficient in our use of resources. Efficiency in this case means that we want situations in which if anyone can be made better off without harming anyone else, they can be made better off. As you may have learned as you may have learned in your economics classes, there's one problem with looking at efficiency. It doesn't tell us how the resources are distributed between people. Some people, it's perfectly efficient for one person to get everything and everyone else to get nothing. But this does create problems from a social justice perspective, and it does create problems from an environmental perspective. How so? Well, first of all, if we look at every single moral teaching that exists that I've ever come across, the moral teachings of the Abrahamic religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, of Hinduism, of most indigenous people, indigenous religions, we find that there's some idea that it's morally wrong for one person to have too much while other people don't have enough. There are a few belief systems which say, oh, that's just fine. As we'll say, there's some other problems with that. But we may believe, if we follow one of these religions, or even if we don't follow this religion in particular, we may have a belief that it's wrong for me to be very well off while other people are suffering. Personally, I'd like to live in a world where people don't have to suffer quite so much. And if you've lived, as I have lived, in India or in the poorest parts of Mexico, or other countries you may have been to, those are the places where I've spent the most time, Nepal as well. You've seen people who live on nothing, and each day they have to go and scramble just to get, say, a few grains of rice or tortillas to eat. And I feel like, well, I'm a fortunate person. I can afford to buy new clothes. I can afford to have a comfortable office. I live in a very hot climate here in Texas, but I can afford air conditioning. I think it's right that people should have access to comfort, to a little bit of security. So that's one reason why equity is a problem. But there's a couple other reasons why this issue of equity or justice in the distribution of resources can be a problem. The second reason is we know from a lot of research that societies which have very high levels of inequality, which is actually starting to happen here in the United States. Historically, we had moderate levels of inequality in the United States, but in the last couple of decades, we're having increasingly high levels of inequality. These kind of societies tend to be more violent, more dangerous, have more political upheavals. And they tend to have lower economic growth because many of the people who could buy things, well, they can't buy things because they're poor. So there's problems, even if you're wealthy, of living in a society with a very high level of inequality. And we're starting to experience that in the United States. A lot of people are saying we have slower growth, or we may have slower growth in the United States in the future, in part because we've become such an unequal society. But why is this an environmental problem? This is an environmental problem in a lot of places in the developing world where you have high levels of inequality, very poor people, and they get driven out. The wealthy people take their resources. So just as an example, let's say I'm in India and I want to build a factory. Well, where am I going to get the land to build a factory? Well, I'll just go talk to some politicians who are politically powerful, and we'll get those poor people driven out of our out of this land. They'll get moved away, and we'll build our factory here. Okay, that's wonderful for me. I got rid of those poor people, and now I have land for my factory. What are those poor people going to do? They don't have a job. They don't have a way of making a living. They used to have their farmland here, but they don't anymore. Well, likely they're going to go cut down the forest somewhere, settle in that forest area, and then people are going to say, oh, it's these poor people who are causing the problems in the forest. Well, is it the poor people? Or is it the people who drove them out of their land? This is very common. This isn't a story I'm making up. I've found this story everywhere I've been in the developing world. And we say, oh, it's poor people who cut down the forest. Poor people are causing deforestation. But it's often actually, they may be the direct cause, but indirectly, they're being driven out. They're being excluded from using the resources. If we divided up our resources of the world better, maybe even if those of us in very wealthy societies were more able to help these people out and give them employment, then they wouldn't need to go and cut down more forests. That's the first reason why this matters. There's a second environmental problem that happens. And this is what happens in Houston, actually. Houston is a famous example of this, which is poor people may not get driven out, excuse me, but if we want to build a very polluting industry, let's say, let's say an oil refinery, then we want to build it in a place where the people aren't going to resist very much. So we're not going to build it in a place where there's lots of wealthy people, lots of people who are going to care about their environment and have a lot of power to stop our pollution. We want a place where those kind of people will never notice it. So you know what we should do? We should find the poorest neighborhood in Houston and let's make sure it's minorities who live there, black people, or maybe poor Mexican immigrants. Let's build our factory there. There won't be resistance. There we can get away with breaking the environmental laws because, those people aren't really going to be able to organize there, even if they try to organize against it. So we have this phenomena in the United States where polluting industries are disproportionately located near where poor people live. And you know what happens then? The kids who grow up in those neighborhoods, they don't breathe good air. They may not drink good water. And actually this happens. They're more exposed to lead. You know what happens when you're more exposed to lead? It damages your brain, particularly when you're a child. So then the people who grow up in that neighborhood, they stay poor. They have less capabilities. And I think that's really wrong. So this is a very important issue and something you should be aware of as you look at your environmental problems.